Good morning. I'm Raynard Smith. I'm Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology and Pastoral Care here at New Brunswick Seminary, and I'm also the chair of the Ministry Studies Department, out of which this lecture series is derived. We're grateful for you being with us this early Saturday morning. I'm sure there were other things that you could have done, but you purposed to be here, and we're grateful to have you here with us today. We're grateful for this opportunity to reflect on something that I think is important. I see Arlene is here, someone else Vivian's here, and I think Fu Yin is here from Intro. I will be lecturing on this as one of the sixth stage of the family life cycle, which is one component of that is retirement. And it's not always very easy for people. How do we make that transition? So we're going to hear from people who have done that and people who are in the process of thinking of doing that, and also hopefully have some good conversation around how do we make that transition, and what happens to the call. So I'm excited. I'm hoping to take some notes so that I can add to my lecture when we come to it on the family life cycle. So again, thank you all for coming. Let us start with prayer. O gracious God of the universe, we give you thanks for giving us this day that we might come and be together in this place. We ask your blessings upon us and upon all that we say and do. We ask that you will dip us into the wisdom, the storehouse of your wisdom, that we might come out with a greater understanding of what it means to be called and what it means to transition and how might that look. We ask your blessings upon each presenter, our institution, and all of our attendees here today. Be with us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we're grateful. This is the Mark Kraai lecture, and we have the person after whom this lecture series is named after. United Reformed Church in Somerville. He was pastoring there, and when he retired, they thought highly of him that they would put together a lecture series in his honor. And so we're grateful to have him here, and he's going to be talking to us something that he has been experiencing. And many of those who are here. So we're looking forward to a conversation on retirement, clergy retirement. For some, it can be unsettling, and for others, it's welcomed. And so we're going to hear about that and tease that out. We're grateful to have our president with us, Dr. Micah McCreary, and I'm going to ask if he would come at this time to greet us, and then after that, we're going to give you the hands of Dr. Milas. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Good morning. I was in New Orleans a few years ago helping ministers with the fact that they had survived Katrina 10 years and they were making the transitions and they were struggling, so they called me as a pastoral psychologist to come in and to help them. And we started helping people learn to do rap again, play saxophone again, and different ways to enjoy their lives. But one pastor said something when we look at transition that stuck with me. He said he had a parishioner who before Katrina had spent a lot of time remodeling her house and getting her house together and had gotten it in pristine condition. And then when the winds began to blow, it blew a tree into her house, and it fell through the roof and damaged her house. And she was angry with God and frustrated that this tree was there. But then when the levees broke and the waters began to come in, she was able to climb up that tree to get out of her house and find safety. And so we look at retirement sometimes as a bad thing, but it can be like that tree that has fallen and allows us an exit out of a very stressful, troubling situation. And so I welcome you to this conversation. I welcome you home to New Brunswick Theological Seminary, a seminary with a heart for God, a light in God's cities, a place where we're helping people to think critically, act justly, and lead faithfully. Welcome. God bless.
Thank you, Dr. McCreary. At this time, Dr. Patrick Milas will come and he'll take us further in our program. He's the director of our Gardner Sage Library and assistant professor of theological bibliography and research, and he's a member of the Ministry Studies Department. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So it's my honor to introduce the Reverend Dr. Mark A. Kraai. He is the professor of Practical Theology, Emeritus at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, where he served from 1998 until his retirement in 2008. In this position, he oversaw the placement of seminary students as interns and worked with pastors to train them in mentoring seminary students. He also taught a course called Ministerium, which guided the seminary students in learning church administration. Dr. Kraai graduated from Northwestern College and then enrolled in the bi-level multi-site program offered by the Reformed Church in America. He entered New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where he studied for 2 years, and then as part of an experimental program of the 2 RCA seminaries, he completed 2 more years at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, earning his Master of Divinity degree from Western in 1974. He was licensed and ordained by the classis of East Sioux and became the assistant pastor of the Fellowship Reformed Church of Lombard, Illinois. In 1976, he was called to Bethany Reformed Church of Kalamazoo, Michigan, as the pastor of renewal and church growth. He served in this position for 2 years, and in 1979, he was officially called to become the senior pastor. The Reverend Kraai started many interesting and innovative programs during his time at Bethany, and for several years he hosted as Pastor Mark a television program on WWMT, Under the Rainbow. For several summers, Bethany ran a children's Bible school type program called Kids Can, meeting several times per week. And the program used government funds to feed neighborhood children lunch in the summer months when school was not in session. A hallmark of Reverend Kraai's ministry was his active work with both teenagers and young adults. He facilitated, in conjunction with First Reformed Church, a singles group that met regularly and went on retreats together. The high school and post-high school youth, including some from First Reformed Church, participated in these retreats. In 1984, he accepted a call to become the senior pastor of United Reformed Church of Somerville, New Jersey, where he served until his retirement. During his time there, he earned his Doctor of Ministry degree at Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2003, the General Synod of the Reformed Church of America elected Dr. Kraai as Professor of Theology. And this title means that he serves as a resource person for churches that seek assistance in thinking and acting theologically. We are deeply honored to have Reverend Dr. Kraai back on campus at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. Please join me in welcoming him to share his insight with us.
Thank you. I didn't write that stuff, did I? You wouldn't have heard about Under the Rainbow if I wrote that. I need to tell you a little bit about myself. You've heard about a lot of my work in ministry. Linda and I have been married for now. We got married in 83, so I don't do the math, but it's something like, 26 years? 36 years? We met in Kalamazoo. I had been divorced for about 6 years. Linda's husband had died of cancer, and we met in Kalamazoo. And she was a professor of mathematics at Western Michigan University. We didn't exactly share personalities. She's a type A who wants to do everything and organize everything, and I kind of fly by the seat of my pants. Some of my colleagues here at the seminary will tell you that's probably true. But we have been together for 36 years. She taught at Western Michigan University. When we moved out here, she got a position at Drew University, and she was there until we retired in 2008. When it came time for us to retire, we said, okay, where? We decided we didn't want to go to Florida. We decided we didn't want to go to Arizona. We thought about where is the best place in the world, and where is it that we really felt a sense of excitement, and that was Kalamazoo. People thought we were a little crazy, but one of the things about Kalamazoo that I most appreciate is that it is an incredibly progressive town. It was noted initially for Upjohn Pharmaceuticals. And Upjohn got bought by a whole bunch of different people until finally it became Pfizer. And that kind of changed the character of Upjohn. And it changed a bit of the character of Kalamazoo. But Kalamazoo also is a place where there were other things. If you've ever ridden in a checker cab, thank Kalamazoo. Anybody play guitars and you got a Gibson guitar, thank Kalamazoo. If you've been in the hospital and you've laid in a striker bed, thank Kalamazoo. And if you happen to live in Kalamazoo and you have a kid who's going to college, if they're there for 4 years of high school, Kalamazoo will pay for their 4 years of college. That's the Kalamazoo promise. Kalamazoo is a great place. So we thought about moving back there, and we did. Now, I'm supposed to talk about retirement. And I said yes to Raynard, and I thought, okay. And then as I started thinking about it, I realized I'm no expert on retirement. I mean, look at the situation. I am one person with one set of circumstances that dictated my one move to retire in Kalamazoo. If I look across this group, I'm guessing that you guys have to deal with a whole lot more thinking than Linda and I had to do. One of the questions you need to ask is, where am I going to go? Where do you retire? Do you stay in the same church? Do you stay in the same house if you've had a housing allowance? If you don't have a housing allowance and you're living in a manse or an apartment or a parsonage, where do you go? Do you stay in the same town? If you got kids, what do? Do you move to be close to your kids? Do you finally move to get away from your kids? Do your kids have kids? Do you want to go live close to your grandchildren? Do you end up taking care of your grandchildren? So many variables. Do you want to keep doing ministry? Or do you want to do something completely different? Do you want to drive cars for the local Honda dealer? Do you want to drive people back and forth from their work to the place where they're getting their car serviced? Do you want to drive Uber? Do you want to do something completely different? Or do you want to continue with some of what you were called to do when you were in full-time ministry? So many questions. And I realized I can answer very few of those. And then I reflected. I retired from the seminary as a professor of practical theology. My job at the seminary was to train students to reflect theologically. So what I decided to do today is to share some pieces of my story and to do a little theological reflection myself, but to see if I can get you guys to inform me what is the best direction for me to move theologically and ministry-wise with this stuff. So, I'm glad you came. I'm looking for your wisdom. You can tell me where I go with the next phase of my life. Before I do that, I want to point out that there are 3 basics that you need to think about. This is sort of a prelude to retirement. And This is not rocket science. It's stuff you probably already know. But that prelude says, you need to, if you're thinking about retirement, or if you're there already, this is something you still need to concern yourself with. And the three components I'm talking about are, number one, finances. Yes, finances. You got to have enough money to somehow step away from a place that gives you money. One of the things I read was that you're going to need to have about 80% of what you got. You need to build your budget around that. I think that's pretty conservative, pretty risky. It may even need to be more than that. My own experience, we have been able to do, I can't give you numbers, but we've cut back enough. Help that the cost of living in Kalamazoo, Michigan is a bit different than it was in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. But you need to concern yourself with finances. I can't tell you how to do that. You need to talk to your CPA or an investment counselor, maybe some denominational gurus that can help you with that kind of thing. You need to talk to somebody who knows. And then you need to share what you've got, what you anticipate getting, when you anticipate getting, the Medicare payments, when you need to think about getting Social Security. Finances. Oh, and build in on finances insurance. This is telling tales in the Reformed Church, but when you retire from the Reformed Church ministry, your church-provided insurance stops. That was pretty significant. We thought about that, Linda and I, and it turned out that Drew University would pay for a portion of the insurance after you retired, no matter how old you were. And so about 4 or 5 years before we retired, we got into Drew's insurance. I think the seminary appreciated that. At any rate, that made the difference. You also need to think about something that's come up, and that's long-term care insurance. Because as you think about retirement, what's happening is that's going to be, in many cases, a third of your life. And so what does it look like at the end of that third? That's an issue. I can't tell you much about that either. I know that in the Reformed Church, we had an opportunity to sign up when we began our ministries. I did, and so we've got some, but that's an issue. Those are the dimensions of finances. I've already talked some about place. The interesting part of place is if you stay in place, how do you relate to your former parish or your former colleagues? I don't have a lot of answers to that because I didn't. But it would be interesting to hear some comments from folks about all of that. If you stay and you are worshiping in the church that you served as pastor, what's your role? I know that for me, I went back to Kalamazoo, and from time to time I'd worship at the church I served. And there were a lot of folks there that still remembered me. They still talked to me. I felt some comfort in that. But for me, and it wasn't their problem, I think they were good. It wasn't like they came up to me and expected me to be their pastor. But the issue was inside of me. How do I respond to them? If I wanted to become friends with them, could I do that? And I had a struggle, and I found I could not resolve that. I'm not sure why, but I could not resolve that. I couldn't take off the clergy collar and step around as just a friend. So I have been worshiping in a different congregation. And interestingly, the pastor of that congregation was a student at New Brunswick Seminary, and he spent a year with us at United Reformed Church in Somerville. And so then the challenge for me was to sit in the pews and to be fed spiritually by someone who was one of my students. I've actually been able to do a bit of that. although I do sit back and scratch my head and say, where did he get that? One of the things that I'm finding, and this is a curious thing, but it's not a surprise if I look back at my life, and one of the surprising things is I need to learn how to be ministered to as a person in the church. I need to learn to be fed spiritually by a sermon. I need to be fed by a liturgy. It's coming. I've only been retired 10 years, so give me some time, but it's coming. Third component of thinking about retirement is, what do I do now? Somehow, and this was something I read someplace, I wish I could quote it, but it's not mine, but you need to set goals for retirement. I did. One of my goals was to read a biography of every president of the United States. Actually, that came from a friend of ours here in New Jersey. She taught political science up at Drew. She said when she started her career, that was one of her goals, and I thought, that'd be a good goal. So I started. It's a good thing I've got another 20 years or so, but it's been an interesting experience. One of the other things that was my goal was I wanted to take tuba lessons. I played the tuba from 5th grade through college. I never owned my own horn, that was the issue. So I took a sabbatical until, it's about 20 years ago. My dad wanted to give us boys something before he died, and so he gave a gift. Well, I couldn't figure out what to do with that, so it's sitting there in my bank account until the custodian at our church in Somerville died. This was Gary. It turned out he, in his younger days, had played trumpet with Louis Prima's band, a big band day in the 40s. And he retired and needed money, and so he became our custodian. And as a sidelight, he played with Marshall's Dixieland Band. Yes. You've heard Marshall's? Okay. Jerry played with him. Well, Jerry died. He had cancer and died, and we decided we'd have a Dixieland funeral. And we asked Marshalls to come in. They came in and they rehearsed in our church, and I was talking to one of the guys there and mentioned that I'd played the tuba when I was a kid. He said, well, why don't you play with us? I said, I don't have a horn. He said, why don't you borrow one? Go to the high school, borrow a horn. So I did. And after a hiatus of about 20 years, I was able to get through When the Saints Go Marching In. And I got the bug. When that gift came from my dad, I went out and bought a used tuba, connected with a couple of different community bands in New Jersey. Well, the deal is, when you play tuba, it's kind of strange. And I had never had a lesson from a tuba player. The closest I came was the middle school band director who played the trombone. When I went to high school, our band director played the oboe. Does not translate much. So I found at the local college a guy that was just graduating with a degree, a master's in tuba performance, connected with him and took lessons. That's one of the things I did until he got divorced and then just fell off the radar, and I haven't had a chance to do tuba lessons since. I've connected with the Kalamazoo Concert Band, best band I've ever played with. I like to garden. We moved into a condominium, and it turns out that outside the condominium on the mall in downtown Kalamazoo, there are flower beds. And I have volunteered. It's turned out now I've got 5 of them. So I garden. I like to bike ride. And I like to preach around, and that was one of my goals. And Linda and I decided we wanted to travel, and we've done that. You need to think about a couple of things, or 3 or 4 things in setting those goals. Goals need to fit your personality. And if I look at this, they fit my personality. They need to fit your situation. I had time for all of this stuff, and so I could do it. And I like to think. In fact, it was inspired by a commercial. You've seen that commercial, I don't even remember what it's for, but this grandfather is flipping open the newspaper and he sees this sports car, and it's his dream, and he goes to his financial counselor, and the financial counselor says, yeah, we can make it work. But then his kids say, well, we're going to be moving. Our daughter has to finish her senior year. Can you do it? And they say, yeah, we'll do it. And so the next thing you see is the grandfather sitting there with a mask on his face as his granddaughter is sitting next to him with a mask on her face, supposedly for beauty. I wanted to clarify that. And the next thing you see is him offering her keys to her own car. And what it says is, she says, but what about your dream? And he says, dreams change. Dreams change. One of the other challenges about retirement is to recognize that dreams change, and you can have dreams and you can have new dreams. You're not locked in. One of the other things to think about if you have goals is to periodically examine them. Part of that is looking at your calling as well. I'm going to say some more about calling because that's important, and that's in the case studies, so hang on there. But one last word, and this word of warning comes from my wife, Linda. She is fond of saying to me, remember, when you retire, you are no longer God. That comes from an experience. I was over in Somerville, and one morning I'm walking out of my study with my robe on, and Chris Peak is sitting here in the chair. He's maybe 5 years old. He looks up at me and says, hi, God. I need to be reminded often that I am no longer God. I'm no longer the one. And what she's essentially saying is that in some ways, you no longer have that glorified position of pastor, of reverend. And so you need to remember that, she says to me. And there are problems with that. I'll say a little more about that later, but somehow to come to terms with what it means to step away from whatever position, whatever authority, whatever influence we had, and to step into a new world. That becomes an important part of setting those goals. And finally, and I'm not saying anything that you probably haven't thought about, but when you step away from that called position and you step into a new world, whatever it looks like, it's a reassessment of who we are. It's a reassessment of our identity. It's a reassessment of who God continues to call us to be and what God calls us to do. And if we can do that, then we find value in our changed circumstances. Okay, that's enough of a prelude. I'm not keeping track of time. What's it look like? What time do I need to finish? I got to watch here. What's it say? You know the old joke about this? Yeah, Taylor knows it. These kids, Protestant and Catholic kid, decide they're going to go to each other's church. And so the first thing that they do is they go to a Catholic Mass. And, they come in with a parade, and the Protestant kid says, what's that? And he says, oh, they're coming in. They're bringing the Bible. And they then do some incense. It's a very high church. He says, what's that? Oh, that's supposed to be the Holy Spirit. And he describes everything along the way. And they have the wafer, and they have the wine. And the kid finishes. Then they go to the Protestant church. And the first thing the pastor does is take off his watch and lay it across his pulpit. And the Catholic kid says, "What does that mean?" And the Protestant kid says, "Absolutely nothing." So what time do I finish?
You have to talk 11:25.
11:25. Okay, very good. Case study 1, okay? I invite you to listen, and then I've done my theological reflection, which is included in your packet. When I moved back to Kalamazoo, one of my hopes was to pair with another pastor, preferably a woman, and then we would offer our services to churches whose pastor had moved on and were searching for another. Essentially, we'd fill in by preaching. They would have consistent preaching every week. They'd have some pastoral care. There's even the possibility of some teaching if that were happening. Well, I got there. I got to Kalamazoo. And I'm sad to say I found that there were very, very few ordained women in my classes, which is the regional church of the Reformed Church. All of them were tied up with either kids or other teaching positions. And so there was not a person to connect with, particularly a woman. I also found out that churches had their list of pastors that they would call if they needed pulpit supply. There are a lot of Reformed Church retired ministers there. And so I put my name on the list, but it's down the bottom. And the other thing I found out was that I wasn't remembered much. And so it was the kind of thing where, okay, this guy's no different than anybody else. We'll put your name on the list, but that's it. My first years were pretty dry as far as being able to preach or fill in church circles. I also attended North Presbyterian Church. That's not a Reformed church, you may have noticed in its name. I was living downtown, and I wanted to worship in a church that had not subscribed to that terrible, terrible recipe of white flight. All of the other churches had done that out of the north side of Kalamazoo, except for North Presbyterian. And so I went there. And it was a marvelous, marvelous blended, diverse congregation with a particular ministry to people who have developmental disabilities. I enjoyed that. I also wanted to be of help to the community, so I volunteered at something called Ministry with Community. This was an organization that provided all kinds of stuff for folks who were homeless or folks that were economically challenged, that were living on the edge, living on the streets. My job started out to be just simply serving meals. And what was neat about it, it wasn't a buffet where they come up with their plates. They'd sit at a table, raise their hand, and we'd come and wait on them. That was a good experience. And just as a footnote, a couple of years after I started doing that, there was actually the minister who had started Ministry with Community was there too. And he would play gospel music on the piano. Nice jazzy gospel music. Well, I also played the string bass, which I actually had one. And so the two of us connected with that. And that's how I would work at Ministry with Community. I attended Isaac, which was an interfaith movement for social change. How can we help the community? And it was there that I met a guy named Nathan Dennison. Nathan's story was that he was a United Church of Christ pastor. He was filling in at a Christian church, Disciples of Christ. They were without a pastor and they were looking for a new one. He was looking to finish another degree and he was looking to get married. Well, as the time wore on, we got to know each other, and Nathan said to me, "Would you think about it? Would you take that church?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to talk to him about that." So he set us up. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ folk were a little nervous. They knew the Reformed Church, and it was pretty conservative there in southwest Michigan. And they were a little worried that I wouldn't fit. So I told them I'd spent a bunch of time out east, and they said, oh, well, in that case. And so I did. I began to preach there every Sunday. Monday, I would teach a Bible study or a book study class. I'd call on folks that were in the hospital. And it was good. I was beginning to catch some of that old calling again, and I felt good about that. And then as I started examining the circumstances, I began to get a little uncomfortable. Part of it was because they weren't looking at what they were called to do. They were just very comfortable. They weren't looking for someone new as a pastor to come in and help them move to the next step. And so I started talking to them about the time I was going to wrap things up. Made them a little nervous, but what I agreed to do with them was to sit down and put together a 5-year plan. 5-year plan because they had $100,000 in the bank, and they needed $20,000 each year to pay a full-time minister. So that was the finances. Then we talked about markers along the way. I felt good about how I was wrapping things up with them. And so I finished. There was a new pastor that came in. She too was a part-time, but at any rate, the plan was there. So that's the end of that story, except this past month, I've been preaching there. They've ignored that plan. And the sad part of the circumstance is, instead of preaching to 45 or 50 people, the last month I preached 14. Well, this is sort of a part of my story. This is part of where I've gone. This is the narrative of the case study. The basic question now becomes, stepping out of full-time ministry, what's my sense of call? What's my sense of vocation? What's my sense of identity? Now, I invite you to get that case study out. It should be in there, and it looks like this. I'm going to read it for you. And when I finish reading, what I'd like to do is to have you kind of put your head together with 2 or 3 other people and give a critique. Give a critique. I'm sorry Faye didn't hear that. She was one of my students. I think she would jump at the chance of critiquing me. So when you connect with Faye, tell her it's fair game. I think they're running to get a copy, but I'll start. What I'm using is a style of theological reflection that comes out of this book. It's called Theological Reflection, but a question mark, so at least there's a little bit of strangeness there. And we're looking at Thomas Groom's method of theological reflection. There are 5 steps in the process you'll see. But at any rate, let me begin reading. Stepping into retirement, how is our vocation, our calling, the same? How is it different? There was a familiarity in all that I was doing in the Christian church. I was doing what I had done for 25 years in other settings. But because this was a church in a different denomination, with a more liberal theological stance than my home denomination, I found that I had more freedom in preparing sermons. I could take theological risks, try on different biblical interpretations, and offer more challenges to involve in social involvements. In many ways, this church fit my personal understanding of theology better than my home denomination. I felt freer in my ministry. Now, critical reflection. What changed? Unfortunately, there are too many variables to make a clear-cut scientific conclusion. By the way, that's inspired by my wife, the scientist, who says anytime you change something, there can only be one variable. One variable was the fact that I was retired. I could take risks, and if they didn't like me and decided to fire me, I wasn't out on my ear. I didn't have much to lose. Likewise, because these folks were from a different denomination, I didn't risk getting hauled in front of our theology commission to study my orthodoxy. Yeah, the ones that are laughing are Reformed church folks, you notice. Also, this was a relatively small congregation who had been struggling for years. So even if I didn't pull in enamored crowds of new members, I had nothing to lose. Realistically, it's clear that all these factors led to my sense of freedom. And having said this out loud, or more precisely, having put it on paper, I have a sense of sadness as I write this. What if I had had that sense of freedom throughout my years of ministry? How would the congregations I served be different? How would I have been different? How would my contribution to the kingdom of God been different? And I need to tell you, in the first draft of this thing, I took time to look at all three of my called ministries and the seminary, and didn't come up with a lot of conclusions. In Gomes' style, he now invites us to take part of the Christian story and the vision, the biblical vision, and intertwine it with what fits with this situation. See if this fits. Interestingly, as I was preparing this lecture, I was also preparing to preach on Luke 5, 1 through 11. This is Jesus' call to Simon Peter, not the one where Jesus calls him to become a disciple. It's the one where he tells Simon, the professional fisherman, how to fish. One preacher pointed out that Jesus merely asks Simon to do what Simon knows how to do. Nothing more, nothing less. If I take this lesson to heart, then my freedom in ministry comes when I do what I know what to do for the kingdom of God. In that same lectionary reading is Isaiah 6, 1 through 8, where the prophet is in God's holy temple and hears the call, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" And without question or curiosity about the end result, or even what the journey will look like, responds with enthusiasm, "Here I am, send me." If I take this lesson to heart, then perhaps my freedom in ministry comes when I hone my hearing to God's call to something new, something different, something risky without a clear path ahead. I wonder, not long ago when our denomination asked our classis to vote on an amendment to our book of church order that would define marriage as only between a man and a woman, I was the sole voice to speak out against it. I quoted the voice out of Simon Peter's dream, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This was a risk. It was also a sense of freedom. I was being true to myself and my understanding of the gospel. I have wondered if I would have done so while I was a pastor here. As it turned out, I've gotten fewer invitations to preach. But one pastor who was struggling with this issue told me that he changed his vote to vote against the amendment. I'm wondering now where this will all lead me. Gomes says now there has to be a dialogue, a dialectical hermetics. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Let's see what comes out of that. If I listen and perceive what's happening as I write this, the main theme is sensing freedom in ministry, a sense of calling, and then response to that call that is faithful to the gospel and faithful to who God has made me to be. In some ways, it's a dialogue between my own sense of integrity and ministering in a structured church. It's using the familiar to carry out God's call to ministry, and it's taking the risk to go even if it isn't clear where I'm going. I use the familiar to do some ministry. I still preach on occasion. I've taught students in something akin to a certificate program. I've taught classes in the local congregation. Presently, I'm on call on members of the Christian church who are homebound or in the hospital. It's what I know to do. Interestingly, as I reflect on it, I'm finding that some of my ministry happens more by accident than by design. It's the going call to ministry. See if this fits, because I'm not sure about this, but I know I needed to share it. I walk our dog on the pedestrian mall in Kalamazoo. It's a block away from the gospel ministry and ministry with community. Many of the people from these ministries settle into the benches on the mall just outside our door. As it turns out, our dog Daisy shows no partiality. She figures she can get petted by anyone, no matter who they are, how much they make, what color their skin is, how old they are, or even if they don't particularly like dogs. She tries. I've used her as an entry to talk to these folks. I now know many of them by name. I know a little of their stories. They know some of mine. In a small way, I trust I'm sharing something of God's love with them as I try to offer them mine. And then a miracle happens. Last July, I got a call that my oldest brother was under hospice care. He'd had Parkinson's disease for 7 years. I made plans to travel from Michigan to Iowa to be with him. The evening before I left, I was walking Daisy and bumped into Dan, one of the street people, who has a big heart, but also a serious alcoholic problem. I told him I wouldn't be around over the next while because I was going to be with my brother who was very ill. I drove to Iowa on Thursday and was with my brother and his wife when he died on Friday. When I got home, I was once again walking Daisy when we bumped into Dan, and the first thing he asked was, "How's your brother?" I told him he had died, but I was with him, and that's when Dan grabbed my hand in both of his and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he didn't let go. For some reason, through that sincere handshake, I felt the grace of God flow. And the roles had changed. Dan was ministering to me. As I reflect on it today, I sense that some of my ministry as a retiree is to be ministered to by even the most unlikely people. How to live the Christian life? So where do I go from here? How do I hear God's continuing call to me to offer what I know to do and what is comfortable to me to the building of God's kingdom? To take the risk and say, "Here I am, send me," with no thought about where the journey takes me and where it may end? How do I maintain and find more freedom in ministry? Interestingly, I just finished preaching the last 4 Sundays at the Christian church. It was very familiar, very comfortable. It was a delightful experience in freedom in ministry. I continue to work with the vitalization committee in our classes. I hadn't described the vitalization committee, so let me do that. We have in our classes 3 committees. One is for students. One is for starting new churches. And vitalization that does everything else. It's crazy business, but that's the way they set it up. I continue to be the chair of that committee. Right now, we're working with a very small congregation with the expectation that they will close their doors. That's not familiar nor comfortable. Neither is a personal risk for me. I will continue to walk my dog and talk with the folks on our benches. And talking with Linda about all this, she says I need more hands-on ministry with people. I need to get one-on-one with them. I believe her. I'm not sure where that will lead me, but there are plenty of opportunities around. So, the basic questions. How do I listen for God's continuing call? What does that call say? Where does God send me? I'll keep asking the questions. I'm going to take we've got a limited amount of time, but I'd like to share one more. And I don't know if we'll get to all of the steps in the theological reflection, but I wanted to share the story. I mentioned the vitalization committee that I chair. Unfortunately, in May of 2016, our committee was pulled into a situation where the pastor of the church, a larger church in our classis, he had confessed to an affair. I'm not going to go into the details. That's all the private stuff that we really can't do. But our committee was pulled in. I went with him as he confessed to his board of elders, and we began the process of how do we deal with this now? Well, early in June of 2016, I had a detached retina. Anybody here have a detached retina? Oh, you've missed it. Oh. Let me tell you what happens. The detached retina means that the retina is pulled away from the back of your eyeball, and the treatment for that is they poke a hole in your eye, drain out all the fluid, put a bubble in there, pump the bubble up, and it pushes the retina back up, and it reattaches. Well, one of the realities is if it's the back of your eye, your head has to be down. So for 3 or 4 weeks, I'm sitting in what my wife lovingly has called my chair from hell. Actually, it's not too bad. It's that massage thing you see in the all of the airports. They're ready to massage you. Well, you sit there with your face down. You can't read because your eyes move. You can't do the computer because your eyes move. The only thing you can do is through a little mirror on the floor, watch daytime television. I have changed my definition of hell. Well, the sad circumstance in this, and this is a time for booing and hissing, my wife Linda sort of became my secretary. She would read emails to me from the committee, from the church, from the pastor. She would type my responses and edit them more times than I think I'm aware. But this was the stupidest move I've done in a long time, because she ended up getting enmeshed in this whole messy thing. And it wasn't fair. It was just terrible. She came at it from a woman's perspective. And there were a lot of dimensions of this whole affair that just were horrendous. And she reacted as someone who could understand how it happened, why it happened, and what it was doing to the woman. My job was to see if there's anything that can be done with reconciliation for this guy, or reinstatement even. We were at loggerheads, button heads, time after time. Morning, afternoon, anytime this would come up. Finally, it got to the point where I recognized my eye had healed, but we were still talking about the issues over and over and over again. Finally, I recognized this has to stop. We talked about it. I stepped down from the committee. Very fast, the case study. Now, this could happen whether you're retired or not, but the fact that she was available and the fact that she was there and could do that kind of service made it much easier. If I were to think about this experience, as I've thought about this, the issue that is raised for me, what does it mean for the two to become one? When I think about the biblical picture of marriage, how much do you have to agree? And if you don't, how do you still remain one with the disagreement? We got 10 minutes left. Let me just share a few of my thoughts, and you can ponder this over lunch. My definition of a good marriage is where you've got two independent people who could make it on their own, but who sense that together their lives would be richer, and together they are called to be husband and wife. I believe there is as much a calling to be a spouse as there is to be a minister. That's how I entered this. I'm not sure Linda agrees with that calling, but at any rate, that's where I was looking at this picture. If I looked at our pattern of living, we had two separate careers. She as the mathematician, me as the clergy and faculty member. When we retired, we tried to do some things together. She had volunteered at the YWCA, and I was going to go and volunteer as well. I had visions of playing my guitar and singing with the little kids that are in their daycare center. I got there. I had made application about 3 years prior and gotten no response. So when I got there, I went to the CEO and I complained. And she said, well, we need a volunteer coordinator. Why don't you and your wife do that? And we tried. And that lasted for about 5 months. Turns out, once again, we kind of couldn't work together. A while later, Linda decided she was going to start a neighborhood association of downtown residents. I thought, this is great. I want a dog park. I'll work on it that way. We continued to work together. And I pulled out of the neighborhood association and worked on the dog park, and she continued. We don't do well working together. Now, is working together a part of being one? When I look biblically, I don't see a lot of pictures in the Old or New Testament of two independent people who have said, well, we could live alone, but we're going to put our lives together because it'll be richer and it is our calling from God. What you hear about calling from God is Paul saying, well, if you burn, then you better get married, I guess. I don't have a good biblical vision of how that fits for where I believe I am at and Linda and I are at. The dialogue continues. Am I called to be married? This, I believe, is something I'd say yes to. But there is that tension. So then the question is, if we can't work together, what is it that makes us one? One of the interesting things is that she is Roman Catholic by birth and by practice, and I'm in the Reformed Church. So when you look at some of the dimensions of faith, we can share some, but there's a lot that is different. And I think there may be some of God's grace and miraculous hand that we have stayed together for 36 years. What can I say? So the question becomes for me, how do we resolve that tension, and how do we become more one? By the way, we vacation very well together. Thank you. I'm going to wrap things up. This is not a comprehensive look at retirement. What I've hoped to challenge you to do is to treat your life in retirement with theological reflection, the events that come along the way. Don't let them just happen. Yeah, you may not have to preach about it. Yeah, you may not be looking for illustrations for your sermons, but still, take a look. Where has God's hand been? Where has that hand led you? Where is it pulling you along, kicking and screaming into something new? Where is it taking what you've got, nurturing it and saying, this is where I want you to work? That's where I would challenge you. And that's, for me, the sermon I would preach to myself. So, that's it. I thank you very much. It's been a delight to be with you today. Okay.
for a moment. We have a few minutes for some questions and answers with Dr. Kraai. If anyone has any questions, please.
When you look at how you're going to spend the day off, because now you have 3 of them, and you have to think theologically and biblically about sustaining yourself, not just financially. Do you have any words to speak to that?
We good Reformed folk are covenant theologians. And I think that covenant is, for me, what's come lately is much more than just the covenant with God, but it's what does it mean to have a covenant with each other. And I think it's finding that covenant. I'm still working on that. That committee I deal with, there's a sense of covenant there, and I really respect it, and it's been helpful. I haven't found a home church where I fit in. I continue to worship at the one where my student is preaching, but that grows, covenant grows that. I think it's finding a covenant. And one of the other things, moving from New Jersey to Kalamazoo meant I left a covenant group I had here. And frankly, I haven't developed another one as, for whatever reason, finding kindred spirits. So it's the people you connect with. That's all I can say.
That's why I'm never leaving New Jersey.
That's a plan.
One thought that I'm hearing too is the whole issue of the 3-legged stool. Love God, love your heart, soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the piece that I hear you saying is that the self part of really loving ourselves is pivotal to doing the other two. And we don't spend enough time really working and growing on the self. And so the brokenness that we have winds up in our relationships, winds up with our God.
It's ironic, isn't it? We step into or out of public ministry when we're 65 and we're remaking ourselves. It's like we're teenagers again.
I'm not a minister, but does the church not have a retirement plan in place so that when you do retire and you are single and you need insurance for different things, that they don't help provide for that? In your, you know, when you're paying for things, the church, for the minister, they're not thinking that far ahead?
Sure. Yeah, we have an assistance program.
Okay.
When it's needed, but we really hope that, and we try to get the clergy to think about this earlier on
Right.
and plan.
Also, you said when you retire, then your insurance cuts off.
No, right.
Oh.
It doesn't
Clarification.
cut off.
Oh.
It just starts having to be paid by them because the church that they are serving isn't paying it.
Right.
So that's a huge, but that's something that everybody knows.
Right.
It just isn't a reality until all of a sudden they look at that amount of money.
So like as a layperson, if you had a 401 at your job, that would transfer, that you could transfer monies, you have to learn how to manage that, but
That's
you
right, and
have
that's
to
what
think
Mark
about
said
that
about
also
having a financial
early
plan.
on.
Right.
And
Okay.
you're talking about the RCA. And
It depends on
of the other
denomination.
denominations in this room, it's a different answer.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Reformed Church.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Mark, for your reflection, the theological reflection, and we also have others. When we thought about this, we wanted to, and you heard a little bit of this, we wanted to begin to think about it and, in terms of the constituent churches for that our school serves. And me coming from, Church of God in Christ, not a mainline denomination, we wanted to hear how are others faring in this space of retirement. And so I wanted to enlarge it and invite folk who I thought might be able to bring us another perspective on retirement. And so we have 3 respondents, and we're going to ask them to come in this order. Reverend Ralph Branch Jr., who's the pastor of Mount Calvary Missionary Baptist Church in Newark. And let me just say that he's the pastor of Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Newark. He graduated from Morehouse College with a bachelor's degree in science. He has a Master of Divinity degree from Palmer Theological Seminary, and he is currently pursuing a Doctor of Ministry degree at New York Theological Seminary, and will graduate in May 2019. Kudos to you there. He is also an adjunct professor of biblical exegesis and church history at New York Theological Seminary. In 2013, he was installed as the 17th moderator of the North Jersey District Missionary Baptist Association. So he presides over a large group of churches in the Missionary Baptist, in the National Baptist tradition? National Baptist tradition. And so we invited him to come to give us a perspective on what it might look like amongst National Baptists, and I would say to you, probably very close, we're your kindred cousins in Church of God in Christ. If you would receive Reverend Ralph Branch Jr. at this time.
Good morning still. I was a little concerned when I was asked to come down and talk about retirement, and I'm sure you're wondering how anyone as young as I'm not that young, could possibly talk about this idea. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for what you've shared, because it is interesting that we have to realize that the conversation is a very broad conversation, and that all situations are not the same. I was born, raised, and now pastor in the Baptist denomination. As the moderator, I am over just about 65 churches in the northern New Jersey area. Those 65 churches do not comprise all of the Baptist churches in our region, but those churches that choose to be a part of a larger voice, a larger denomination. So I have the opportunity to work with churches, to work with pastors work with churches that are in search of pastors, work with pastors that are coming into their first position as pastor, as well as working with some that are transitioning into this area that we call retirement. And it is a very interesting journey. Oftentimes when pastors are coming into the churches, we find that many of them are coming and the position of pastor is not their only, again, stream of income. Perhaps it's a second vocation, it's a late calling in life, and now they are assuming the role of pastor. And oftentimes they will have a structured retirement plan, health care, life insurance that's given by a secular employer. Now, that's wonderful to have, but what happens sometimes is that as they transition into the church, they remove that responsibility from the church, and the church never gets to understand the language and the need to provide some of the things that they are already picking up in their secular positions. Unlike some of the other denominations, we do not, one of the things that we say as Baptists is we enjoy our autonomy. We enjoy the opportunity of not having a governing body tell us what to do. That's wonderful until you get to a point where you wish you had somebody who would have told you what to do. And what happens is my personal journey, I came from a career I worked for the Star-Ledger newspaper for about 20 years prior to becoming a pastor. And as I came into the pastorate, the two careers overlapped. And I came to the point where I wanted to let the newspaper go and devote to ministry. And I refrain from using the term full-time and part-time. I really don't believe in that term. But I simply let the paper go in and devote it all the way to the work of the church. However, in doing so, the church that I was called to, my predecessor was there for 51 years. 51 years. And did a marvelous, wonderful job in that 51-year period. The interesting thing for me is similar to yourself, Dr. Kraai, where you were saying it might be a little difficult for your student to feed you. The church that I was called to, my mother was pregnant in the choir with me in the church that I now pastor. So imagine. Coming into that position, the church was not accustomed to the language of planning for retirement, providing things like health insurance, life insurance, long-term care insurance. They were very comfortable with the idea of parsonage and not really looking at it from a broader perspective. So what I had to do is I had to make sure that they understood that language, because starting 18 years ago, it was not in my plan, and is still not in my plan, to pastor for 51 years. All right, I have a set of hobbies that I love, I enjoy. I would fish every day if I could. I would be on the beach every day if I could. And I plan to get to that point, but it doesn't just happen. It requires a great deal of planning. So I found that many of the pastors that I work with that come to this moment of retirement, there are a few things that they struggle with. Not that some of the natural things are, financially, can I do it? And oftentimes the answer is no. So we find ourselves in the pulpit beyond 65, beyond the years where physically we are vibrant, and even beyond the years sometimes where our message is relevant to where the church is today. But we've still got to eat. We've still got to keep a roof overhead. So I work with so many that come to that point, and then they don't know what to do next. There's a struggle for identity. I've done this all of my life. How do I wake up tomorrow and there not be a congregation calling me pastor? Or how do I wake up next week and there is no pastor's anniversary? There's this real identity struggle that I believe is also compounded by the fact that it is difficult for us, in my denomination, I believe, it's difficult for us to retire and then stay in the same place. The churches that I work with, the pastors that I work with, I highly recommend that even if you're not in a position to relocate to another state, at very least find another church. Because it places the church, can place the church in a very difficult situation, in that now when the new pastor comes, who do we look at? Who do we look to for leadership? How does this relationship move forward in a healthy way? In our denomination, in terms of who the next pastor shall be, there's a strong debate as to whether the outgoing pastor should even be involved in the process of the incoming pastor. So there are denominations, such as the Baptist, that we operate in a culture and context that's comfortable for the local church. How it's done in Newark may be done completely different, may be done differently in New Brunswick, may be done differently in Somerset. It really depends on the congregation and where the congregation is. As we struggle for this identity sometimes, one of the things that does cloud the water is the fact that if I'm retiring as a school teacher and I decide I want some extra income, it's okay for me to go to the local Walmart and perhaps get a part-time job. As a pastor, and I'll make it even more personal, as an African American pastor, that speaks differently to our experience. For me or for us, that may seem as if we've fallen on hard times. So there's this notion, there's this idea that as pastors, one who has sat in that position, that even after retirement, there's a level of esteem that we should have in the community. And I believe that we should have that, but we must understand what it means, number one, and number two, what it takes to maintain that. So one of my fixes, one of the areas that I've devoted my doctoral work to is how to equip pastors within our denomination to prepare for these moments. And one of the things that I believe wholeheartedly is, while we do not have a structured governing body saying this is where your retirement funds come from, this is where your continuance will come from in terms of health insurance, making sure that every pastor, no matter what age, from day one begins to plan for their retirement, because it is coming. It's coming one of two ways. Either you're going to say, I'm ready to go, or they're going to say, it's time to go. One way or another, that time is coming. And too often the time comes and we find ourselves unprepared, ill-prepared, and we begin to see some of the negative effects that it has, and some of the negative ways that it will manifest itself through self-medication and through suicide and through infidelity, even manifesting itself in a number of ways, when in reality, if there was just a structure, even if it was no more than a mentoring opportunity of someone that has years, who can say to a young woman, who can say to a young man who's new in ministry, that number one, the time will fly. I'm 18 years in, and it still seems like yesterday. I got married and became the pastor of the church the same year. Married a woman that I met in the same church that I now pastor. So it becomes a very difficult space, but in identifying who we are, we must add to our identity that retirement should be a part of the equation. I've seen many pastors, and please, I'm not watching my time. My watch doesn't mean anything, so I need you to. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. As we say before I take my seat. So, coming into ministry, one of the things that just wasn't articulated to me is what happens after this. Now that I'm no longer a pastor, does that mean that I'm no longer in ministry? That the call that was placed on my life has an expiration date? And the answer is no. I am a dog advocate, and the only two of the things I shared with Dr. Smith is two of the things that's opened a lot of doors for ministry for me. Been two things: my dogs and my children. People will talk to you about both. And if we can see ourselves post-retirement as being as valuable as we were when we were preparing a sermon every week, when they were calling us pastor, then I believe it helps that transition to become a lot easier. And of course, if we have taken the proper steps financially in that process, I am a strong believer in, wherever you can, maintain at least three sources of income. Because while the church loves you today, I've seen it too many times where in the Baptist church, we have this ongoing joke that we're one church meeting away from unemployment. We literally are. And I believe that the calling that God has placed on our lives, that we must be responsible to that call, not only in preparation, but understand and hear the voice of God, even when God says it's time to let go, time to move, or time to redefine who you are and how you do what I've called you to do. So the way for us is not always clear. It's not always cut. There is no manual that comes at our installation. It really depends on the culture of the church, what they understand, and even more importantly, what the incoming pastor, who will soon be the retiring pastor, what their lens is. Because if preparation doesn't begin at day one, then year 65 or whatever the year may be becomes a lot more difficult. And for that reason, I've seen many pastors almost forced to hold on beyond their years of effectiveness. In closing, that's my second time, I got one more time. Pastor that I respect greatly, known for many years, retired properly and retired well. I asked him some years ago, as I shared with him, I said, how did you know it was time? How did you know it was time? And he said to me that he was literally in his home preparing for bed, and he said that the Lord spoke to him. The same Lord who called him spoke to him and said, it's time to go. And he said he began to talk with the Lord and question the Lord and say, Lord, that I'm not quite ready. He said that the Lord told him, even if you don't go, I'm leaving you. Wow. And as a result of that, he understood that he could not be effective if the anointing, if the power of the Lord was not behind his call. He could no longer stay in that place. And he had faith enough to retire. And since he's retired, he has served several other congregations as interim, and he loves saying, I can just go preach and not go to any of their meetings. He enjoys that, and the Lord has really blessed him through that process, as well as the church that he left. So the church doesn't have to go from 300 members to 100 members to 50 members because the church is struggling with leadership. When it's time, we must be in a position to accept God's move in God's time. Right?
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Branch, for that perspective. And it's the perspective that you brought is actually of the denomination, Church of God in Christ, that I'm experiencing now. Exactly. So we're kindred cousins on that aspect. So I thank you for that perspective. Our second respondent is Reverend Dr. Henrietta Scott Fullard, and she's the presiding elder of the Jamaica Long Island District of AME churches. So she has a large group of churches that I believe you said 25? 21 that she's responsible to. She has a bachelor's degree of science degree in chemistry from South Carolina State College, a Master of Arts in Science Education from Teachers College of Columbia University, a Master of Divinity from New Brunswick Theological Seminary, so she's one of our graduates here, alumni. She has received 2 honorary degrees, Doctor of Divinity and a Doctor of Education. And she has extensive experience in teaching as a science teacher and serving as a high school administrator principal. In 1987, she became an associate minister at Allen AME Church in Jamaica, New York. She was ordained in 1991 as an itinerant elder in the AME Church and was assigned to the pastorate of the Allen Temple AME Church in Mount Vernon, New York. In 1995, she began serving as pastor of Bethel AME Church in Arverne, New York. In 2004, she was appointed presiding elder of the historic Philadelphia district, the mother district of the Philadelphia Annual Conference for the AME churches. In 2005, she was appointed presiding elder of Jamaica, Long Island District of 21 African American Episcopal churches in the New York Annual Conference. Reverend Fuller has been actively involved in many community, civic associations, and fraternal organizations throughout her career. And she's here, as I was speaking with her, she's one who's about to launch into that space of retirement within the AME Church. So we're looking forward to the perspective that she brings. Welcome, Reverend Fuller.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Well, we have 15 minutes till afternoon. Good morning to everyone, and to all of you who have come to share in this moment so that all of us can receive and share and be better when we reach that point. I am about maybe 2 months away from that, and I just want to inform you that it can be difficult and can be great, depending on how your preparation is. But I searched the Bible, as many of you are Bible scholars, and I have not found the word retirement in the Bible. If you know what chapter and verse I could find it, please let me know. When we were called by God, I didn't hear that word. So obviously, it is something that we're adding in that we want to include as part of our calling. Is that advisable? Well, yes. And so I just want to be brief with my opinion about this. I always take a radical point of view, and please forgive me this morning. I want to thank Reverend Faye for suggesting that I be a part of this and to the invitation to come. Thank you so much. The question is, how should and when should one make preparations for retirement? Retirement is a term that is psychologically based at the time of the entry into an occupation or a phase of life, or an idea or a journey. Retirement can be included as part of a journey. For example, if you were to take a trip, and many of us have taken trips, there are several steps you need to make when you're planning your trip. Let's, for discussion, say that the trip we are planning is a trip to retirement. Not to Europe, not to the Caribbean, not to the famous islands, but to retirement. But we make the same type of preparation as if we were going on a major vacation or trip. So if you were going to Europe, for example, you would plan the days of the year that you would be going. You would have already have in your mind what you want to do when you get there. It's a plan for an inclusive moment. A trip anywhere has to begin with an inclusive moment. A moment where you look at every phase of what you will be doing from the time you think you want to go there until you return. And so when I plan a vacation or a trip, if you will, I'm going to get the idea of where I want to go. And then I want to decide, what do I want to do when I get there? And then I want to look at my finances to see if I can afford to go there. Once I do that, then I will be looking at my budget to see where I can include everything that I will need for this journey. Once you have that, then you want to get your travel documents, your passport, your professional ID, your visas, whatever is needed. And then you go and you purchase these things. We're talking about a trip to retirement, okay? I need to purchase a round-trip ticket so that when I get where I'm going, I need to know that I already have the money or the ticket to get back. I don't want to go there and then decide, well, how do I plan to get back where I came from or back home? The preparation has to be made prior to your going. I need to know how I'm going to get there. If I'm going to fly, or if I'm going to drive, I need to know what vehicle I have, what car I have, and I need to have that car ready to make that particular journey so it doesn't break down on the way. I'm talking about retirement. And then if I don't actually know how to get there in a vehicle, I may need to get my GPS, something that's going to help me know the way. I'll need to get this at the beginning of the trip, not once I get on the trip and get lost and say, well, I wish I had a GPS. I could find my way around. I'm talking about retirement. And so we begin with the moment that you have this idea that you want to take a trip. And now you have to sit down long before the trip dates come. You have to sit down and decide how you're going to structure your plan, as I just outlined, so that this trip is easy and it follows the plan precisely. You decide where you're going, when are you going, how are you going to get there, what are you going to do when you get there, what tours will you take on the trip, how long will you stay, what clothing will you pack to carry, what documents would you need to travel with, how much money do you need to have with you so that you can buy souvenirs. Those are plans you think about before the trip, not once you get to where the trip is. And so you need to know then the when, what, how, why of retirement so that you can step out of time into the moment of retirement with a plan that you have already worked out. So this retirement preparation may take or may begin with your occupation that you're in. In this case, it is your clergy or your ministry. And you need to know what is the preparation that I have to do for this particular phase of the journey. Yes, we have been to seminary. We've had an excellent training here at New Brunswick, where I received my what did I get? MDiv. And it benefited me well. But then once I got it, what do I do with it? And how is that then going to help me along the journey? And then once I get on the journey, I have to look at where I'm going and how I plan to get there. So as I'm going along on my journey, I need to be thinking of these things before time, not once I get to where I am. So at the same time, I'm looking at the agenda of retirement, looking at finances, looking at my lodging place, where will I stay, my hotel that I'm going to stay in. I will be looking at who will travel with me. Am I going to take any family members? Am I going to have the children with me on my trip? Then once I get into retirement, I need to have this plan in front of me, ready to implement. So retirement is not the time to start fixing the plan. It's the time to implement it and enjoy the plan. So the preparation for retirement doesn't start at retirement. It starts along the journey, step by step. And so I'm from the AME, African Methodist Episcopal denomination. As you may know, that has a governing body. And I brought along with me a copy of the laws and bylaws and government of the AME Church, the structure of the AME Church. And every AME church follows this document precisely. Precisely, right, Reverend Faye? Precisely. This is it. We follow the book. But back in the days, I would say in the early 80s, the governing body had the wisdom to put the requirements for retirements in the book so that every AME church and every pastor or clergy member and even every employee of the churches can benefit from some of these retirements. So I'd like to share some of them with you quickly. There is in this book a Department of Retirement, a certified department with a commission chair and with its personnel, and they oversee the retirement of all AME clergy members in the AME Church. The executive head of the department has a specific job to make sure that every church in the AME Church follows the retirement guidelines, that every clergy person, and especially every pastor, follows the guidelines. And may I just share a few of them with you. The executive director oversees, directs, and manages the ministerial annuities fund of the AME Church and is responsible for the operation of the retirement and hospitalization coverage for the salaried servants of the AME Church, those clergy and pastors who are paid. This governing body makes sure that these benefits extend to those persons. As administrator of the Ministerial Annuities Fund of the Retirement Service Department, the executive director oversees the stipend for all retired ministers, salaried employees, and their families. In addition, the executive director administers insurance coverage for all salaried employees of the AME Church, bishops, ministers, and general officers. The executive director is bonded for such amounts as directed by the General Conference. Specifically, employment and supervision of personnel includes providing directions and delegations and specific responsibilities for making sure that every minister, every clergy person is included in this coverage by the AME Church. They maintain records of the contributions payable by the participants. They forward quarterly statements to each participant to let them know. In the secular world, I think this process or these annuity funds are similar to what we call IRAs. Anybody heard of IRAs? Which is more like an investment fund where individuals contribute to the fund, and it can be market-driven, you might say, some of them. So with the interest and the stock market value, these IRAs can increase. And so the funds that are coming into the retirement department of the AME Church is funded in some kind of investment, so that at the end of your retirement time, you will have built up an egg nest. And at that time, when you say, it is time for me to go, you now have established a certain amount with interest, with all the benefits that come along with it, and you can leave comfortably with some kind of annuity. So along with the built-up monies that you will have, please let me know when it's time. 2 minutes? Okay. Along with the built-up annuity includes your hospitalization, which is mandatory, and the church must pay for it. It includes your health insurance, which is mandatory, and the church must pay for it, for yourself and for your family. And it also includes sometimes educational expenses if you wish to continue your education. So you have the annuities, that's the money that's built up for your retirement, your salaries, the hospitalization for you and your family, the educational part for you and your family, and disability insurance should you become disabled during your administration. So we have in the AME Church these kinds of benefits. So I will tell you that when my time comes in a few weeks, I am going to receive my annuity that I have put into place for the last 20-something years, and I will have the hospitalization and the health insurance, and I will have disability insurance, and I will have a nice egg nest, and I'm going to plan my trip to Europe. Amen?
Wow, all right. So we thank you for that perspective from the AME Church. And so as you can see, there are different ways that different denominations are doing this in terms of addressing the issue of retirement. And I think you're going to see the broadness with amongst our perspectives that we bring. And so our last respondent, the Reverend Canon Dr. Alan Salmon, was ordained to the diaconate and priesthood in 1964 in Trinity Cathedral in Trenton, New Jersey, and has spent his entire ordained ministry in the Diocese of New Jersey. He graduated from Trinity College with Bachelor's of Arts and Master of Arts degrees and received a Master of Divinity from General Theological Seminary, New York. He was and a doctorate of ministry degree from Drew University. He was a curate at Trinity Church in Cranford, New Jersey, the vicar of St. Peter's in Woodbury Heights, New Jersey, and retired in 2003 after 33 years as rector of Christ Church in Riverton, New Jersey. He was named an honorary canon of Trinity Cathedral on the 50th anniversary of his ordination in 2014. So we welcome Reverend Salmon at this time to give us the perspective of as one who's been ordained in the Episcopal Church. Right. Thank you.
Sorry, you have another 15 minutes before you can eat. Or take a bathroom break. Many years ago, in fact, it was in 1954, my mother was driving on Route 130 to New Brunswick to pick up my brother, my older brother, my only brother, at Rutgers, who frequently came home for weekends. It was a miserable, slippery day in February, and the Oldsmobile 98, which she was driving, skidded, turned up on its side, and then bounced back down on the shoulder of the highway. A young man in a pickup truck some distance behind her saw the incident and stopped to help. Mother wasn't injured, but that young man then followed her into New Brunswick to my brother's dorm. The young man was a seminarian from this institution. So I have been grateful, as was my mother, ever since. So I'm happy to join you for this symposium on retirement, if only to say thank you for your young man. And I can sit down, you know. Be sincere, be sincere, be brief, be seated. At any rate, if my part doesn't go well in this day, you can blame your director of the library Dr. T. Patrick Milas, for suggesting me. One of the first joys of retirement is the ability to say no. Knowing Patrick as I do, however, I couldn't exercise that hard-won choice. So here I am at the age of 81, still supplying, still substituting in parishes in more southerly part of our state. Currently, I'm at St. Peter's in Medford, been there since last June, as they are in the process of calling a new rector. For 33 years before retiring in 2003, as was just mentioned, I was rector of Christ Church, Riverton, and before that, it was already said, I was a curate in Cranford, and then way south in Woodbury Heights for 4 years. Dr. Smith suggested some guiding questions for these remarks, the first concerning one's call, sense of vocation, and identity in post-retirement years. Well, ordained first as a deacon, then a priest in the Episcopal Church 55 years ago, most of my life has been in orders and still is. You know I know you all know about old Melchizedek, that king of Salem and priest of God Most High, who blessed Abram in Genesis. And you know the psalmist's reference to Melchizedek. The Lord has sworn and will not recant. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek became the symbol of the ideal king priest of whose order Christ was called a member in Hebrews. A priest forever am I, but I have been reminded of the fragility of that thought in the minds of people. For instance, in ShopRite, while I was mulling over the vast choice of egg noodles, a person approached me and asked, "Didn't you used to be Father Salmon?" "Now and forever," I replied. That's happened twice in ShopRite. Must be the water. The author of Hebrews goes to great lengths to point out the humility with which one exercises priesthood, something of which, after the ShopRite incidents, I admit to reminding myself on a daily basis, and try, as the writer of Hebrews implores, to approach the throne of grace with boldness, only so that we may find mercy and grace to help in time of need. All this to say that I find no problem in being myself a baptized and confirmed Christian who is also sacramentally ordained to priesthood, which is Christ's, not mine. And as long as I am healthy and reasonably of sound mind, that may be questionable, I intend to keep practicing priesthood and all it entails until I drop into the arms of God in death, when, in the words of the commendation to God in the burial office of the Book of Common Prayer, my true identity will be exposed as a sheep of thine own fold, a lamb of thine own flock, and a sinner of thine own redeeming. Wonderful words of Bishop John Cozen from 1627. One of the great gifts of retirement, nonetheless, is the ability to say no without fear of rejection or remorse. I mean, I said yes to just about every single request I ever got, to do this, to attend that, or write something else. Anything to help the people of the congregation to fulfill their ministries and dreams or serve their pastoral needs. As I have aged, I find that driving to hospitals in Philadelphia does not make for a fun trip, so I have declined. I have been surprised at the gracious acceptance of people when I have made that known to them, particularly at St. Peter's now. And nothing, no parish function or emergency will now interfere with the Philadelphia Orchestra concerts and Opera Philadelphia performances I now can attend with alacrity and not worrying about the emergency coming up. Nothing will take precedence over those evenings. And I go into the city by high-speed line. I don't drive. Craig Barnes, now over at Princeton Seminary, wrote an article back in September in which he spoke of missing funerals as a parish minister. I do too, and that has surprised me. Because preaching at funerals of people you have known for as many years as I knew the people in Riverton in a congregation became soul-filled and grace-drenched experiences. They were exhausting at the very least. But at those moments before the public rites, when silence is more potent than prayer, I realized just how much it meant to be with people when, as Barnes put it in his article, their souls are exposed. So as difficult as it was, I was surprised that I miss it. I do not miss weddings. And that doesn't surprise me, for those are the times when common sense flies out the door and ladies' bare backs are more exposed than their souls. On the other hand, when I have baptized a child, then prepared him or her for confirmation by the bishop, and then officiated at their wedding, and then baptized their children, those cycles of life and love cannot be quantified or appreciated enough. It's a joy and a privilege beyond measure. I miss some of that, despite the rampaging secularization of marriage and the rites that now surround it. I have mentioned preaching at funerals. Preaching is important to me because preaching to congregations who don't know you can be a new challenge in retirement. Long pastoral connections develop a sort of shorthand, and people know something of what to expect. To surprise them, even in those situations, is still important, but it takes a special effort to reach people who know very little about you, to develop any sense of trust that you are who you say you are, or appear to be, in order that your words resonate with their experiences. There is a different language in today's world with people than before. All these new icons and apps and acronyms and techie stuff that a 3-year-old can manipulate and before which I stand blank-eyed, looking like a moose head on someone's trophy wall. I don't want to feed people warmed over lumpy oatmeal when they need bangers and mash. Well, that was my Church of England grandmother just popped in. Rather, I should feed them beef and mashed potatoes. I still basically follow the old maxim that for every minute in the pulpit, you must spend an hour at least of preparation. So these days, I find it to be a weekly challenge in my present role as supply priest, wherever I am, to speak the word that can be heard. As we age, our bodies let us know there are some things we simply can't do as agilely as when we were 40. I'm fortunate in having rather good health, which I monitor carefully, but I hold on to handrails more consciously than I did a decade ago, and I have purposely lost 130 pounds in the past 4 years. And while it seems retired folk have as many doctor's visits as the proverbial Carter has liver pills, no one really wants to hear all your complaints and maladies. So I say to my aging friends, go to someone who gets paid to listen to you. And I do not drive in the passing lane going 10 miles under the speed limit. That irks me no end. Easter vigils in a darkened church can be a challenge, if not a hazard. I fell over last year in one, tripped on the step because I couldn't see it in the dark. I wasn't used to that church. I think of Garson Kanan's comment nonetheless. Youth is a gift of nature. Age is a work of art. Some of us must work at our art. To Dr. Smith's question about my vision for a happy retirement, in addition to health issues, I well remember, and this has been mentioned, a wise bishop advised my first-year seminary class to plan financially for the future. He said, you will have the pension. The Episcopal Church has a wonderful pension system, although salaries were lower than others on balance to pay for it. Do not opt out of Social Security. That was a choice you had in 1961. And third, plan to save and invest some from your own small stipends, no matter how little. I started at $3,600 a year, folks, in 1964, and I tithed. I say that not to be proud, but honest. So it wasn't easy, but I did it. And although financial instruments are far more sophisticated today, I am indeed grateful for a somewhat settled sense of security. I still pick up pennies, hoping they were nickels, in the parking lot. It was suggested that I comment on my place or role within the congregation or denomination I serve. Within the Episcopal Church, and specifically this Diocese of New Jersey, I am still a priest in good standing with seat, voice, and vote in all conventions and convocations. And at the appointment of the bishop, I still serve on the benefits committee, so I can look out for our own benefits as retired folk. That's why they keep me there. As I mentioned, a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, so we plug on. Policy in our tradition respecting my position as far as the congregation I serve for 33 years, or anyone else for that matter, is one of practicality and pastoral concern. To allow a new rector to develop his or her own pastoral style and relationships is vital to the health of the parish. And it cannot be done if the old former priest is constantly present. Therefore, our policy is that the former rector does not interfere in any way in the new relationship being established. I've refused all requests to perform baptisms, marriages, or burials. Although I have attended several over the years, I just sit in the very back of the congregation. It's a hard thing for people to grasp, even for me, but it is necessary. Now, that said, I have maintained close friendships with many of my former parishioners, and we socialize frequently. I had 6 of them in last night for dinner, and they'd stayed till midnight, so, yeah. But discussion of my successor is always out of bounds. It was indeed hard to exercise the say-no power of retirement in such incidences. It quite honestly has to be that way, and in the end is right and proper. It's hard for new dance partners to learn the tango if the old dance partner keeps cutting in. Retirement is good. I no longer worry about the heating and the lighting bills and the 3 19th century stone buildings that were in my charge in Riverton, or the overly long meetings. If I weren't running them, they were very short, but when I wasn't running them, I often wondered, what did we get accomplished? I don't miss the sometimes grumpy old fogies who thought the tail feather of the Holy Spirit, dipped in blood, wrote every word of the Bible. King James Version only. As much as I love the King James Version and its linguistic and poetic cadence. Retirement, however, does have its moments of new things, new birth, new vision, powerful memories, and satisfying stories of precious people and stirring events. An inscription at Ad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, puts it this way: forgetfulness is the way to exile. Remembrance is the way to redemption. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus said. And so we do, and always remember. We remember that every child comes with the guarantee that God is never discouraged. And no matter our status, retired or not retired, we remember and we act, and we keep telling the story. Our story of Jesus is the story, and it continues to be told, must be told, retired or not. A group of clergy, some retired, most are not, they're active, that I meet with every Thursday morning at a diner for breakfast. I have half jokingly said to them a couple of weeks ago that if I become forgetful or a little dotty, would they be kind enough to tell me gently so I might be able to avoid any possibly embarrassing situations? Tell you, one of them quipped, we told you that last week. So much for friends who have yet to face the joys of retired bliss. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Nice to have met you, Dr. Kraai, and to Patrick for his putting me on the hook. And to you for listening.
Thank you, Reverend Salmon, for your witty approach to retirement. And thank you, Reverend Fullard and Reverend Branch, and to our special, our guest presenter, Dr. Mark Kraai. Thank you all for your contribution to this discussion.